High School District 303 Board of Education regular meeting is now in session. Would you all please rise and join in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda, roll call. Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Alessandrini.
Here.
Hill. Here. Boheimer.
Here.
O'Neill.
Here.
Rui.
Here.
Wrigley. Here. Howard.
Here. We have the necessary quorum and we'll proceed with the approval of minutes. Those minutes being the Operation and Maintenance Committee meeting of July 28th, the Policy Committee meeting of July 28th, the regular board meeting of July 28th, and the closed session of that regular board meeting on July 28th, as well as the Operation and Maintenance Committee meeting of August the 18th. Do we have a motion? Thank you, Mrs. Hoheimer. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Questions, comments, or discussion? Hearing none, Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Boheimer.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Minutes approved as presented. Next item on the agenda is board applause. Tonight we'll start on the other end with Mr. Rui. Mr. Rui, do you have a board applause?
I do not.
Thank you, Mr. Rui. It's kind of hard this time of year to come up with one. How about Mr. Wrigley?
Likewise, I do not have one this month.
That's fine, Mr. Wrigley. How about Mrs. Hoheimer?
I have one. I ran in the Roberts Run for Dyslexia last Sunday morning, and Miss Call and Mrs. Gilmore. I ran with them. Of course, Mrs. Gilmore left me in her dust, and so did Miss Call. But I did finish, and I was glad to see them out there representing our school, and it was really nice. It was a fun day.
Well, Mrs. Hoheimer, you certainly get an E for effort.
Thanks.
More than the rest of us did. Mr. Hill, how about you?
I'd just like to congratulate the buildings and ground staff on getting the high school ready to go. They had a challenging day today, I know, with the heat, but when we took the tour of the facility today, you could tell they made every effort to make the building as comfortable as possible, so thank you to them.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. How about Mr. O'Neill?
I'd just like to say welcome back to all the students and staff.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. That's a great one. How about Mr. Alessandrini?
I'll echo Mr. Hill and comments in regards to the building and ground staff. The building looks good and ready to go.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandrini. I'll direct my board applause to the luncheon that we had last week. I thought the luncheon was excellent. They always are. It was great recognizing the people for years of service to the district. And they did something new and different this year. They had a motivational speaker in FM Peterson Theater. So on a whim, I decided to stick around and listen. And I thought the man was extraordinary. I thought I brought his leaflet with me, but apparently I did not. So I don't remember his name. Was it Shepard?
Dave Shepard.
It was Shepard. Dave Shepard. But he spoke nonstop for 1 hour and 45 minutes. And I would say he had direct contact with at least 30% of that audience, and he had 100% of that audience in his hand. I mean, he had their attention, and it was an excellent presentation. I think it was well received by the staff, and my own opinion is I think it was a good idea to have done that. So I want to applaud that. Thank you. Next item would be student council, but I don't see Emily anywhere. So we're not going to get one apparently. Also, at this point in the agenda, we always have public comments. If there's a member in the audience who wants to address the board on a non-agenda item, now's the time to do it. If you have comments on an agenda item, then you will be given that opportunity when we get to that agenda item. Is there anyone here that would like to address the board? Okay, thank you. Moving on, next item, we need to do approval of claims.
Mr. President, I move for the payment of monthly warrants in the amount of $1,645,422.65 per summary information found in the agenda and detailed information also found in the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Alessandrini. Do we have a second? Second, Mrs. Holheimer. We have a motion and a second to approve the warrants as presented. Is there any comments or questions or discussion? Hearing none, Mr. White, are you ready?
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Hoheimer.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Warrants approved as presented. You'll also find information on bank balances, district investments, medical care report on pages 29, 30, and 31. You'll find a financial statement as of July 31st, board bills as of August 25th, and manual checks as of August 25th on pages 32, 55, and 100. Next item. At this point in the agenda, we have need for a closed session regarding the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees of the public body or legal counsel for the public body, including hearing testimony on a complaint lodged against an employee of the public body or against legal counsel for the public body to determine its validity, and the setting of a price for sale or lease of property owned by the public body. Do we have such a motion? Thank you, Mrs. Holheimer, second by Mr. Hill. Motion by Mrs. Hill, Mrs. Holheimer, second by Mr. Hill. Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hoheimer.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. The board will go into closed session. At the end of that closed session, we will return to this room and continue on with board business. Let the record indicate the board is back in open session at 7:24 p.m. Next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. We have items dealing with employment certified, employment substitute certified, we have employment support, we have volunteers and chaperones, and we have a donation. All this material is in your supportive material, and I will not go into the detail at this point in time. I would be looking for a motion for board approval on the consent agenda items 5.1.1 through 5.1.2 as presented, including the personnel report and pending background checks as necessary. Do we have such a motion?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Second by Mrs. Hoheimer. Questions, comments, or discussion at this point on the consent agenda? Hearing none, Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hill.
Aye.
Hoheimer.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Consent agenda is approved as presented. Next item on the agenda is we're going to open some closed minutes, right, Mrs. Hoheimer?
We are. The policy committee has reviewed minutes of 16 closed meetings dating from October 28, 2013 through June 5th of 2014, and is recommending that minutes of the following 4 closed session board meetings be open to the public. 5.2.1, the closed session meeting of the regular board meeting on December 16, 2013. 5.2.2, the closed session of the regular board meeting of January 27, 2014. 5.2.3, the closed session of the regular board meeting on February 24, 2014. And 5.2.4, the closed session of the special board meeting on March 10th of 2014.
This motion to recommend board approval to open the public minutes of the 16 December of 2013 and 27 January, 24 February, and 10 March 2014 closed session meetings comes from committee. The motion is made by Mrs. Hoheimer and it does not require a second. Are there questions or comments or discussion? Hearing none, Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hoheimer.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Closed minutes are now open. Next item on the agenda, policies for a first reading. Mrs. Hoheimer.
The policy committee is presenting 7 policies for a first reading, 6 revised and 1 new. Please note that two additional policies listed on the page number to the right are not included because suggested press changes considered during review were confined to just the footnotes and legal citations and/or administrative procedure references, or because legal counsel and the administration have advised that suggested press changes are not necessary for the district and current policy wording should be retained intact. Also, 2 new exhibits were considered, but their addition to the board policy manual was not recommended by the committee. We have 5.3 policy 3.50, general school administration, policy 4.100 operational services, policy 4.170 operational services, safety, policy 4.175, and this is new, it's not operational services, and policy 5.280, that's educational support personnel, policy 6.150 instruction, and policy 7.250 students support services.
Thank you, Mrs. Hoheimer. And as before, this motion comes from committee to recommend board approval to lay over policies 3.50, 4.100, 4.170, 4.175, 5.280, 6.150, and 7.250 as presented for action at a future date. Are there any questions or comments? Just an observation, Mrs. Hoheimer. A lot of times they'll take an old policy and take a chunk of it and take another old policy and make a chunk of it, and then they put them together and make a new policy, don't they?
And they do.
Yeah, I think they just do the exercise just to be doing it sometimes.
I do agree.
Any comments? Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hoheimer.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. These policies will be laid over for action at a future date. Next item on the agenda, renewal of a contract for the District Resource School and Police Liaison Officer, Mr. DePatis.
Yeah, last year, we revised that agreement with the city of Pekin. And when we were looking back at it for this year, realized, previously it had not been revised for, I think, about 10 years. And so those revisions got things up to date to what was actual practice. But the agreement was only for 1 year. And so by renewing it this year, we had a clause put in there that now at this point, from this point forward, it will renew automatically each year unless the parties decide to make revisions to it.
Okay. At this point, we'd be looking for a motion to recommend board approval to renew the contract between the district and the city of Pekin for the resource or school police liaison officer as presented. Do we have such a motion?
So,
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Second, Mr. O'Neill. Motion by Mr. Hill, second by Mr. O'Neill to approve the motion as presented. Is there questions, comments, or discussion?
last year's contract, was it still 50%?
Yes, it's the same, everything's the same. Last year's contract or agreement was just for 1 year, and so now this one is again for a year, but it has a clause that will automatically renew unless the parties decide to make a change. All the substance pieces of it are still the same as they were last year.
Can I ask one other question too, just for clarification? Not that I have an issue with what we do. When he comes and kind of heads up the team of police officers at large athletic events, is he paid by us Or is we pay half of his overtime for that too?
I believe we pay half of whatever we've got there, is that right, Carl? Yeah.
So we don't pay his full amount just because
Right.
he's an employee, we still pay half of what he can make. Okay, thank you.
Good questions, any more?
Yeah, quick question. When said officer has been either sick or on assignment or something during the normal school day, does the city normally provide a replacement for him temporarily, or are we without a liaison officer that day?
I think it was just a one-day thing. I don't think we have anybody there unless it's a longer term where he's gonna be gone more than just a day. If it's 3 or 4 or 5 days, then they have, that's part of the agreement that's in there, we have that.
Right, I was reading that portion of the agreement. I was a bit.
Typically though, if it's just a one-day thing, typically they don't send another officer over.
Okay. Okay.
All parties know in advance, and so they know to call the police department directly, and the police department also knows who's gonna be out of the building, so they know exactly, who the go-to people are.
Right, and we have several of our own security staff here at the high school anyway, too, I believe. Okay, very good.
Great questions. Any more? Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hill.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Boheimer.
Aye.
Ruy.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Contract has been renewed. Next item on the agenda, 2015 close-up trip, Mr. DePatis.
Yeah, this is the annual trip sponsored by the Social Studies Department. Mr. Denham is this year's faculty advisor. This will be a 6-day, 5-night trip in April, open to any junior or senior. It's going to Washington, D.C., and Board Policy 7327 requires board approval for any trip over 500 miles from Pekin. So that's what the request is for that approval of that close-up trip to Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Mr. DePatis. At this point, we'd be looking for a motion to recommend board approval of the close-up trip to Washington, D.C. for the week of 19 through 24 April 2015 as presented. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Alessandrini, second by Mrs. Hoheimer. Questions, comments, or discussion? Mr. White, are you ready?
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Boheimer.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Ruy.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Close-up trip approved as presented. Next item on the agenda, renewal of the contract with Humana for a Humana Medicare Employer Plan. Mrs. Schaefer.
On page 162 of your materials is the renewal agreement with Humana. We last August put together a package for retirees over 65 to offer them a supplemental advantage program that basically coordinates Medicare with this Humana product. So it's time for renewal. It is a calendar year product. The premium that we currently pay is $266 per month, and the renewal came in at $274.41. So it was minimal. It's an 80-20 split, so the district pays 80%, retirees pay 20%. So they'll see a minimal increase come January 1st for their premiums. So the recommendation would be to have board approval to renew the district's contract with Humana for Medicare Advantage product for retirees 65 or over for plan year running January 1st through December 31st, 2015 at a fixed rate of $274.41 per member per month.
Thank you, Mrs. Schaefer. Do we have such a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Hill, second by Mrs. Hoheimer. Questions, comments, or discussion? Hearing none, Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Hill.
Aye.
Boheimer.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Ruy.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Renewal of the contract with Humana is approved as presented. Next item, Mrs. Schaefer, what we've been waiting with bated breath for is presentation of the tentative 2014-2015 budget.
Okay. You should have in front of you, I provided the actual legal budget form that we have to submit to the State Board of Education, so that's just kind of just a point of reference reference that you can look through later. What I'm gonna focus on though tonight, I think you should all have a copy of the actual PowerPoint presentation as well. So I will just start by going through that first, and if you have questions as I go along, just stop me. It's the same format as I've done in previous years, so what I'd like to discuss first is how we ended for 2013-14. These are unaudited numbers. Our audit doesn't, the auditors come out in September and we'll actually have an audit on these figures, but typically we don't have too many adjustments to what these figures look like. So this is our operating results. So the operating funds are the education fund, the O&M fund, the transportation fund, and working cash. So those are the 4 funds that we're looking at on this slide. We did have an excess in the ed fund of $828,837. We had anticipated an excess, but this was a little bit more than we anticipated by about $345,000. Expenditures came in about $400,000 less than projected, and revenues came in about $74,000 less than anticipated. If you remember, we did amend the budget in June. So we had already adjusted for the 5th mandated categorical that we received, and we also adjusted for various expenditures that we knew. Some of the majority of where the expenditures are less than anticipated is with our health insurance claims. In the O&M fund, we ended within about $30,000 of what we anticipated, so that was pretty close to what we anticipated. That fund does include also, just as a reminder, the $87,905 we received in maintenance grants for fiscal year 14, but some of that work didn't get completed, so we'll see the expenditures in the FY15 budget. Transportation was within $9,300 of what we anticipated. We did also receive an extra categorical in that fund as well for the regular and special ed transportation, which was about $110,000. And working cash came in a little less than we anticipated due to just interest being less than what we had budgeted, and that's just been a continuation of the low interest rates that we continue to see. So overall, the operating budget for 13-14 came in at approximately $373,000 better than what we had originally budgeted. The next slide is the non-operating results, which are the debt service fund, IMRF, tort, capital projects, and health life safety. Overall, we were pretty close on all of those funds. I think we were within $9,200. Overall, the debt service fund is where we pay our bond principal payment and interest payments. So that deficit there is just a snapshot, it's just a point in time. We have about $26,000 left in fund balance because we restructured those bonds. IMRF, we had a little bit of a deficit, same in tort. Capital projects, that fund balance is still sitting there. That's from the insurance settlement quite some time ago. That was a result of the G building ceiling, so there's still a little bit of money left in that fund. And then health life safety, there is revenue of about $1.45 million that was in 13-14 because of the bonds we sold this year for health life safety projects. However, we only did about $245,000 worth of that work, so there's quite a big surplus in there for work that's still yet to be completed. As I typically do, I'll just work my way through what our major sources of revenue are. This allocation has not changed significantly over the last several years. The 3 largest sources of revenue for the district are real estate taxes, which are 59%, general state is 11%, and corporate personal property taxes is 15%. So of those 3, that's 85% of our revenue budget. The other revenue figure of 15% includes federal revenue, other miscellaneous state resources, and interest income. For first source of revenue that I'll talk about is the real estate taxes. What we're working with is, the 2013 levy, will be collected in this year's budget, in the FY15 budget. It's the 13 taxes that are payable in 2014, which affect our 14-15 budget. We collected our first disbursement on July 3rd, and that was about $6.7 million, or 51% of our total extension. We should receive the second disbursement around the first part of October, and typically the last disbursement comes at the end of November. That levy was limited by CPI 1.7%, and we do know for the 2014 levy, which we'll talk about in December, and that will affect our FY16 budget, that will be limited by a CPI of 1.5%. We did have about $284,000 more in real estate taxes in FY15. You can see by the bar graph, though, it's a fairly consistent source of revenue. We did not have any bond abatements that were involved in this levy. However, as I said, we did issue the health life safety bonds, and so that we restructured our existing debt so that we were able to keep our bond payment for FY15 very similar to what our FY14 payment was. The next source of revenue is our corporate personal property replacement taxes. This is just a description of what those taxes are. It's our second major source of revenue, and it's still considered a local source of revenue, even though we get the distribution right from the state of Illinois. The next chart just shows where we've been over the last 6 years. This source of revenue seems to have a little bit more fluctuation in it than real estate taxes are. It's not as predictable. There's some comments that I've made over the course of the last few years about spikes or dips in the replacement tax. For instance, in 10-11, we saw a pretty big spike, and that was due to a tax amnesty program they ran that year. And then the last 3 years has been fairly consistent. They do anticipate a slight increase this year based on the estimates that the Department of Revenue has issued. So we expect about $118,000 more than we received last year, which is about 3.6%. And this is just another illustration of what it's looked like since 07-08, which I believe was the first budget I ever presented. So this is the snapshot of the last 8 budgets. And general state aid, there was a lot of talk this past year about changing the way that formula was calculated. That, however, has not changed. We're still looking at the same funding formula this year again. They do have the foundation level set at $6,119 again per pupil, which we know we never get, but that's the way it's been. That's the number it's been since FY 2010. Last year's revenue was prorated at 89%, and this year we have received our estimate again, and it's also prorated at 89%. We do intend, if you look at the next slide, this shows you a little bit better picture of what our entitlement looks like. The first line is what we would get if we were funded 100%. So this year, regardless if we would have gotten all of our payments or not, we still see a significant decrease in our state aid. We were entitled last year to $3,068,427. We received 2.7, so we lost about $346,000 due to proration. This year, we're only entitled to $2.6 million, and we'll receive approximately $2.3 million, so we'll lose about $286,000 due to proration. But our overall budget is being affected by about $400,000 just because of the decrease in our total entitlement. And that's due to a few things. One is the way that ADA is figured in the formula. We've continued to see a slight decrease in ADA. And also the way that corporate personal property replacement tax is calculated in the formula. They use a calendar year number, and that number for us
was up about $314,000. So because we had increased local resources, it decreased what we are entitled to for general state aid. And this is just another snapshot of what it looks like. And this is just a graph I think I added a couple years ago that shows what our ADA has done since 2007, 2008. Basically, the way it's calculated is the general state aid formula uses the average of the best 3 months of ADA over the 3 previous years. So the 14-15 entitlement uses the average from 11-12, 12-13, and 13-14. So in FY10 payable 11, we were at an ADA of about 1982.63. This year we're at 1855.96. So our ADA is, last year we had a little bit of a spike. Now we're more in line where we were in 12-13. So, oh, you know what? It didn't. That graph didn't pick out my 14-15 number. Sorry. The 14-15 number, that was 1855.96, so. And in 13-14, it was 1893.55. The other sources of revenue are the federal revenue that we get. That's the title grants, and the funding we get from IDEA for special ed, and also we get federal dollars for our school lunch, our national school lunch program. Interest income is also lumped together in the other revenue, and then our mandated categoricals. If you remember when we talked about the amended budget in June, I had budgeted for 4 mandated categoricals, which was the last one of FY13 and 3 in FY14. But we ended up getting all 4 in FY14. So we got 5 during that fiscal year. All sources point to the fact that we should probably only expect to get 3 in FY15. So we had 5 in FY14, we'll probably only get 3 in FY15. Transportation is budgeted at a proration at 72%. And the majority of special ed still continues to remain fully funded. This is just a chart that shows what makes up the allocation of our expenditures. Salary and benefits obviously is our largest expenditure at 58%. We have purchase services at 12%, supplies are at 12%, equipment and capital improvements are at 7%, and tuition and other is 11%. Within salaries and benefits, our salaries are up about $125,000 over prior year. The biggest increase in that category is our health insurance. We did have a good claim year for this past claim, but for the last cycle of health insurance. However, they do anticipate an increase, and so that increased figure is based on actuarial projections based on United Healthcare data. So we've projected an increase in health insurance claims for FY15. Purchase services include Aramark, also includes like our repairs and maintenance and the O&M fund. It includes things like utilities. Supplies are just general classroom supplies and other supplies that are custodial supplies, maintenance supplies. Equipment typically represents anything that's a major expenditure, capital expenditure, typically anything over $500. But that percentage is up this year over previous years. Typically it's not that high, but we have capital improvements included in the budget in the O&M fund for the potential of improvements to a softball field and potential improvements to the stadium with water sealing. So right now in O&M, we have budgeted about $350,000 for the softball field and $220,000 for the stadium. So that's about $570,000 more than what's typically in those accounts.
tuition has stayed, rather steady. We have seen a trend over the last 3 years of significant increases in our out-of-district tuition costs for special ed population, so we typically budget around $1 million. That's where we've been, for costs that we spend on, the special ed population for tuition to other facilities. This is just kind of a comparison of what our revenues and expenditures have looked like. It's kind of all over the place. Some of this is due to timing, you know, the way that funds come in from year to year. Obviously, this graph doesn't look like what we've been able to maintain. I mean, what the board has also always done is try to maintain things. And what's felt in the classroom has been consistent, even though this graph would make you think otherwise, but we've been able to maintain things consistently over the course of the years, even though we've had these peaks and valleys with our revenues and expenditures. The last couple slides are just a summary of what our budget looks like for the tentative budget looks like for the 14-15 school year. Again, the first slide represents our operations. So again, it's education, O&M, transportation, and working cash. In education, we are projecting a deficit of about $461,000, and that's due to our decrease in general state aid dollars of about $300,000, and also our increase in projected health insurance costs. The O&M fund has a deficit of $578,000, and again, that's due to what we've tentatively put in there for those two projects that I just discussed. That would be capital improvements that would come out of that fund. Transportation, we have a slight deficit just because of the proration in our categoricals, and working cash, we have no expenditures coming out of there. That's just interest revenue in that account. So overall, for the operating budget, we're looking at a little over a $1 million deficit. And then in our non-operating funds, it's fairly typical. Health, life, safety, however, is showing a deficit because we had that one-time snapshot of revenue last year. So now we're spending down that revenue on projects that we anticipate in the 14-15 school year. So that's about $490,000 worth of things at this point that we know have been approved, and things that we have put on the cycle to get done during the FY15 budget year. We still do have quite a bit of health, life, safety funds that are still out there waiting to be approved. I think we have a little over $8 million that we still are waiting to hear back on from the state. The majority of that is HVAC that we still don't know for sure if we're going to be able to have approved through health, life, safety funds. So there is still some unknowns out there yet with the health, life, safety fund, but these are the projects that some dollars that have been approved and that we know or we are going to get those projects in FY15. So overall, for the non-operating funds, we're looking at a deficit of about $680,000. So between the 2 years, because we had a surplus in FY14. Between the 2 years, we really have the 2 years are balanced together. Because we were at about a total of $1.8 million in overall in FY14. About $1.9 million in FY14, and we're looking at a deficit this year of about $1.8 million. The budget is on file in the district office for 30 days, and it will be on display until we have our budget hearing at the September 22nd board meeting where the budget will be adopted. When I take any questions?
Carla, just to be clear, you said last year resulted in a surplus of about 1.9, and this year projects to be a deficit of 1.8.
Correct.
Okay. Very good, thanks.
Schaefer, curiosity question on corporate replacement taxes.
Sure.
There's a spike in 10-11. You know what that's contributed to?
I think
What
10-11
caused that?
was, yeah, I think in 10-11 there was a tax amnesty program that was ran. So basically what the state said is if you go ahead and pay your taxes, we're not gonna charge you a penalty. So a lot of corporations paid their tax bill because they knew they weren't gonna get a penalty. So they saw a surge in funds that year.
At this point in the process, we'd be looking for a motion to recommend board approval to place the tentative 2014-2015 district budget on display for public inspection as presented, with adoption at the September 2014 regular Board of Education meeting. Do we have such a motion? Thank you, Mrs. Holheimer. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Questions, comments, or discussion?
Once again, excellent job in presentation. Thank you very much.
You make a whole lot of work look pretty simple there. Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, Mr. White, would you call the roll, please?
Holheimer,
Aye.
O'Neill.
Aye.
Alessandrini.
Aye.
Hill.
Aye.
Rui.
Aye.
Wrigley.
Aye.
Howard.
Aye. Motion carries. Tentative 2014-2015 budget will be put on display, and then we'll move for approval at the September meeting. Next item on the agenda, resignations, Mr. Hill.
Yes, want to make a matter of resignations. Get them pulled up real quick. Oriana Gilston, teacher for the English department, effective August 11th, 2014, and Melissa Harrison, teacher for the English department, effective July 31st, 2014.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Questions or comments? Moving on, we'll ask for a report from the policy committee.
We didn't meet this month.
You enjoyed,
No report.
you enjoyed your break, didn't you?
You betcha.
I thought you might. Next report is operations and maintenance, Mr. Rui.
Okay, I'm also asked the administration if there's, because I'm going to talk about a few things that we talked about in that meeting, obviously, and then some other factors that may impact some of the decisions we make. So if I misspeak or you want to add something, please feel free to. And Mr. Relo feel the same way. Two items that we discussed at length at our last O&M meeting were work to be done to the football stadium and potential work to create a softball facility on campus for the softball program, two of which both projects were committed to. I'm going to start with the football stadium first, or the stadium. There's quite a bit of I don't want to say damage, but wear that's coming onto that football stadium. And it's been prolonged, I guess, as long as we can without actually taking some aggressive steps to prevent future damage that will potentially create a larger expense for us down the road. So we asked the administration to do some work for us in terms of, instead of just sealing or fixing different spots, to actually take the time and fix one of those, fix the entire stadium one side at a time. One side 1 year, one side the next year. With that, it involves removing horizontal and vertical holes, cracks, concrete that's loose, which there is quite a bit, removing loose or exposed rebar, putting corrosion inhibitors on that, installing, replacing the mortar that's broken away, cleaning up the foundation of all that work, and then covering that with a coating that will become more of a waterproof substance as opposed to just spraying a sealant on it. Sealant will not really create a situation where it will be waterproof. It'll just seal it. Okay, it's not going to solve the problem. It's not going to create a situation where that stadium can stand the test of time, which I'm sure is what the public expects of that stadium. The company that they've looked at, or the product, I guess, that they've looked at, has been used at the U of I football stadium and Notre Dame's football stadium. The process of doing this is quite extensive. You have to remove the bleachers, set them aside, do the work, with the bleachers, coat it, with the bleachers back on. So it's a big process and it's an expensive process. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now. We looked at trying to do quadrants and we looked at trying to do sealant, but it's really just going to prolong the inevitable. It's just going to cost more money down the road. I think it's a state right now where we believe that we have to take steps to make sure that that stadium's around for years to come. So it would actually have an entirely new surface over the concrete. They'd actually, after they put the sealant down, they put sand in it to make it so it's not slick, so it's a safety issue as well. We talked a little bit about having our people take off the bleachers, but quite honestly, in talking to the administration, we think that's, number one, it would slow down the process. Number two, if you look at liability or workman's comp or whatever, I don't know if you remember when we took all those wooden bleachers off, but that was quite a process. So we really believe that we should move forward in trying to seal that stadium and getting it set and giving it more years of life and replacing the broken concrete and the cracks and the spalling. And this would also waterproof all the areas underneath there. As you know, probably what this started was we had leaking going on in the new locker rooms, we had leaking going in the concession stands, we had leaking going in the restrooms. They talked about just sealing over those areas, but then you're going to have a sealant that's going to be one color, and the rest of the stadium's going to be another color, and it's going to eventually all have to be done. So the idea, actually, Mr. Wrigley was vocal about this, was trying to get it all done one side and do the other side. It actually works out to be more economical for us if we do it that way. So it is in the budget, but it has to go out for bid. And I'm not asking for an action. This isn't an action item or anything like that tonight. I'm just trying to give you guys an update on the fact that we're really trying to aggressively make a long-term commitment to the stadium, as opposed to slapping a few Band-Aids here and there and have to keep coming back. So before I move on to the next piece, does anybody have any questions about that?
A couple questions.
Yeah.
When you talk about this product, is this on the, what I would call face side, the seating side, or also on the underside also?
No, it's just on the risers, and it's on the treads, so to speak, if you think of like stairs, and it goes up the sides and up the back.
Is there
Probably about
deterioration underneath that needs to be addressed?
There's a certain amount of deterioration underneath, but it's not the root cause as to the leaking. And to the best of our contractors' knowledge, as well as our engineers, it's not a safety issue, the deterioration underneath the stadium. The ceiling would be on top. It's the top surface where the bleachers are. It's the area that's most exposed to weather and to foot traffic and the damage. So
I guess the only reason I bring this up is, my beloved Cubs in Wrigley Field had concrete falling from the underside, and
Yes.
they had to address that, and that's what I don't want to get to a point in.
I think the first step, I'm not saying that couldn't happen down the road, Joe, because this has been going for a while, and because of the state of the stadium as in right now, they're anticipating an acceleration of how fast it'll deteriorate. But until we get the top done, taken care of, prevent any more water from coming down and going underneath there, trying to work from the most critical phase and work our way down. So that's not something they spoke about, but it's certainly something that bears watching.
The second question is, if in fact we remove all the bleachers, or somebody does, and they have to go back, do we get into a issue with improving and having to put in handrails or anything like that? Or are we making improvements to that stadium where it reaches a level where they're going to require us to put a center?
That's an excellent question. I do not know the answer to that. I think that's something that's going to come out when we go through this process. They're referring to this as maintenance of the facility as opposed to improvement of the facility. So that never came up in conversation, but it's certainly a question worth asking. Even if that is the case, I mean, we are running into a situation that I would hate to guess what it would cost to replace that stadium. Again, I think there's going to be more information to come, but we do believe that this is a critical situation for us to take steps and not get to let this thing continue to go in disrepair.
I think part of the answer to your question, Mr. Allison, is this is not a structural rehab. So typically when I'm trying to have to update, it would be when something structurally needs rehabilitated.
That's why we have to put new entrances in too. That's what I worry about.
We'll find that out. I saw Mr. Page write it down, so you can ask that question. And all the caulking and all that stuff is all part of this too. If you look at it, it's worked its way away from one side to the other, or it's missing or whatever. All of that is part of this as well.
Mr. Rui, I'd like to add something if I might. I think you're making a very valid point about that stadium, and we have to do some, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, some long-term thinking. And there are even items that you aren't aware of because you weren't on O&M at the time. Two examples that jump into my mind are the lighting in the stadium is not where it's supposed to be. It's spotty, it doesn't cover the entire field, and you can spend, I forget the number, but hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. And then there's another issue that is right piggybacking on with it, and that is the condition of the sod on the playing field itself, which needs to be recrowned and resodded. And it sticks in my mind that was like $200,000, but I know where you're headed. I completely agree with and support what you are saying and in process of saying.
I think that, those are all things we'd like to do, but they're still manageable at this point. But I think the stadium's getting to a point where we may it's never going to get cheaper to fix this. Okay. Okay, and the other thing, just want to add, it's going to really take a coordinated effort to figure out how to make this work and not avoid, and to avoid standing events that happen in that stadium, i.e. like graduation or fireworks or whatever the case may be. So I think that when we get down the road and we start looking at this and we really start, instead of looking at it from 30,000 feet and we're getting down to the nuts and bolts of it, there'll be some really hard work done by the administration to coordinate this event to try to make sure we accommodate traditional events that happen in the stadium. Second thing we talked about in that last meeting was the desire to get the softball program on campus. Upon reviewing the minutes from the November O&M meeting, the way I read it and I'm interpreting it, at that time we talked about this being a 3 to 5 year project, getting them on campus. I wanted to make it clear that there's no one on the O&M committee that does not believe that it's important to get the girls' softball program on campus and build them a facility that's comparable to other facilities that they go and play. The Park District is a wonderful situation and they do their best, but it's not their facility. So keeping in mind that at one time it was going to be a 3 to 5 year project, we've also been looking at if that process can be sped up a little bit. So we've been, Mr. Payas had the engineers come out and look and see what it would look like, what it would cost, and what could be done to put these field at the first field that's currently there as you come down Dragon Hill Drive off to the right next to the Holy Pond. With that, as you know, there are some drainage issues that have to be dealt with or the field would be wet. And there are some quite extensive, to be honest with you, some things we have to do in terms of creating a way so that field drains appropriately and is not an issue for us. That is also in the budget currently because that's what we said we would do, but at the same time, based on what I read in November, we do have a little bit of window of time there. It's important to realize that we believe that we need to have the girls on campus, and so that they can play softball on campus. We think that that's a facility that needs to be addressed. We just have to do it in a prudent and responsible way. We found out Friday, I believe, that we don't know what's going to happen with the HVAC. We don't know if that's going to be health, life, safety. Am I correct about this? And we're still waiting for some response on that. That's a $8 million project, and we don't know if that's going to be covered by health, life, safety or not. So there are a number of projects that are going on in our campus right now that need to be done. HVAC is one of them, library enhancement, the welding hoods still have to be done, and they have to be done by the start of next school year, or we cannot use that facility, as I understand it. Now, if you notice, the retaining wall in front of the pillars is starting to lose its integrity, and the roof in G building needs to be replaced. We're going to do that in quadrants, most likely. And then there's always the unknowns, things that come up you had no idea that they were going to come up. But if today's any indication of the HVAC need for our building, based on that building or that system wasn't designed to handle 100 plus heat factors, and it couldn't keep up. And so there's just a lot out there for a building of this size and for a campus of this size to keep up with. And I'm going to have to, we'll probably be coming back to you with more information about all of these things. So in reference to the meeting, the two main items were the football, or the stadium, Memorial Stadium, and the softball field, okay? And I've given you a report on those two things, but I just want to throw those other things out to keep in mind that there's a lot on the plate that the district has to address. And I would defer to Mr. Wrigley if you have something you want to add, along with Mr. DePatis or anybody on his team.
I think you covered it very well.
Yeah, I think you did a good job, Tim.
I think, Mr. Rue, you make a very compelling argument for the importance of planning what happens and when it happens.
And I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to suggest we can plan this thing away in terms of the softball facility, because that's something we all want. We just have to make sure that we're advancing plan in a prudent and logical manner.
I mean, the bottom line is if you advance item A, sometimes item B gets put in
There's
the
always
back.
priorities.
Yep,
Yeah.
it's a matter of priorities, exactly right.
But that item can't be a priority that can sit on the shelf for the next 15 years.
Right.
It's more of a priority than that. We just have to be smart about how we move forward.
I totally agree.
That's all. Sorry for the long report.
Thank you for a very good report. Next item, opening of school and institute days, Mr. DePatis.
Excuse me. As Mr. Howard mentioned earlier in his board applause, the opening days were very good, very well received by the staff. Mr. Shepard, that was the guest speaker on Tuesday, was very well received. I thought he held the attention of the staff very well, and I think really got them off to a good start, really feeling like they were going to have a great year. The luncheon went very well. Mr. Steve Clements was awarded the Outstanding Contributor Award this year. I think he was surprised to a point, but it was difficult to make sure he was surprised, having to make sure he got here from Macomb to receive his award. We had talked to his wife earlier and tried to get that to happen, so I don't know if he was completely surprised once he got here, but he was very humbled and very appreciative of the award and very deserving as well. Previous to that, the week before, we did have 3 days of new staff orientation, and that also went very well. I think the staff there really got to bond with each other. We had 20 new staff members at that, right? 20 new staff members that were there for those 3 days, and that was also very good. So I think we're off to a great start, and looking forward to a great year.
Thank you, Mr. DePatis. Are you going to address LMRC and student achievement?
Sure. Our first meeting for LMRC is scheduled for September 4th. This year, we're going to be having those LMRC meetings on the first Thursday of each month. And the Student Achievement Committee, the next meeting for that is September 18th, and those are scheduled for the third Thursday of each month. There may be a month or two where maybe that will be a different day, but in general, it'll be the first Thursday for LMRC and the third Thursday for the Student Achievement Committee.
Thank you, Mr. DePages. Next item on the agenda is future agenda items. Is there a particular item a board member would like to see on a future agenda? Hearing none, we'll move on to announcements by the president. Looking ahead, I want everyone to be aware that the ISV, Central Illinois Valley Fall Dinner Meeting, is scheduled for Wednesday, October 1st at Morton Community High School. And knowing Mr. White, there will be details to follow. Second item, if you're interested, please see Mr. White following this meeting to pick up the 2014-2015 Mid-Illini Conference Activity Passes, the 2014 PCHS football season tickets, and the 2014 parking passes as well. And the last item, the next regular meeting of the Board of Education is scheduled for Monday, September 22nd, 2014, in the boardroom where we are now. This is the business that we have for tonight's meeting, and hearing no objections, I declare this meeting adjourned until our next regularly scheduled meeting. Thank you all.